To begin our adventure with cardiovascular physiology, we're going to first take a look at the anatomy and what's all involved with the cardiovascular system. So, I want you to think of it as being three different entities within the cardiovascular system. You've got the pump, you've got tubes, and you have fluid. Those are our three different things. So, we've got a four-chambered pump, which is our heart. We've got our distribution circuit, which is all of the tubes, which are our blood vessels. And then we have the fluid inside, which is our blood itself. So the distribution circuit that we have kind of a high pressure and a low pressure unit. So the high pressure is the distribution in order to pump it out to the rest of the body. Then we have exchange vessels, and you can see kind of pictures of them here, where it's going from this high pressure and it will diffuse in pressure and then go into the collection circuit that we have here to return it back up into the pump again. And it does it both above our heart and below our heart, all throughout our body. Now, traditionally, when you look at it, for the majority of the time, you will have the distribution circuit being blood that is rich in oxygen. However, and then the collection circuit will be oxygen poor or oxygen deficient blood. It doesn't have quite as much oxygen in it. There are a couple of examples where there is a difference, which is looking at it in our pulmonary system. So, our pulmonary system right here, what you'll notice is that as blood is moving towards the lungs, so it is a distribution, but it's towards the lungs um, as an artery. It actually doesn't have as much oxygen because here in the lungs is where you'll actually be getting the oxygen. So, key terms to kind of keep in mind. We've got our atria, or our top two portions of our pump. We have the ventricles, which are the two bottom portions of our pump. We have the pulmonary circulation that's going to the lungs. And we have the systemic circulation, which is going to the rest of their body. And it's also called peripheral circulation. So, it's kind of termed both ways. This is just showing you another example of this circulatory system, right? So we've got our four-chambered pump right here. Blood will be exiting through the aorta to be delivered up to the head and down to the rest of the body. At each of these different beds, what you'll notice, capillary beds, is you have these capillaries, and this is where a lot of gas exchange is happening, right? So, this is where it's coming into our cells and it's dropping off all this fresh, clean oxygen that it had just picked up from the lungs themselves. Everything will collect back again in veins and travel all the way back to the heart to be able to recycle, pick up oxygen in the lungs, return back to the heart, and pump out again. So please keep in mind that this is not only like the right side and left side of your body, this happens on both sides of your body. This picture is just kind of demonstrating the flow of how things go. So, what are our functions of the heart? Really, what it is we need to generate enough pressure in order to maintain blood flow, and specifically because we need to be able to get oxygen and other nutrients to the tissues. In the process of doing that, it also will pick up waste products that are existing in these areas and remove them, specifically carbon dioxide, as well as other waste products, to be delivered to however they are removed from the body. Some go out through the urine, some go out through our breathing, like carbon dioxide does. But we just need to maintain the pressure for this blood flow to get around in all of the tissues. I kind of think of it like it's like a cargo shipping system, right? Where it's like picking up stuff like oxygen at the main distribution center. It's going to drive all around and drop stuff off. And then sometimes it ends up picking stuff up in garbage at the end, right? And collecting it back and dispersing of that once it gets back to the main station again. So you can kind of think of it that way, like a FedEx delivery truck, and then they sometimes do pickups as well. So, to ensure that blood is flowing only in one direction, because we don't want our blood to be able to bump backwards in our bodies, we have what are called valves in our heart, cardiac valves, and they ensure that everything only goes in one direction. So, less oxygenated blood from the right side of the heart will come up through into the pulmonary circulation to be able to pick up that oxygen and drop off carbon dioxide in the lungs. Then it'll come back into the left side of the heart, and this well oxygenated blood will pass from this left side and out into the rest of the body into systemic circulation. And the heart is creating this pressure gradient that's going all the way from the aorta, which is our largest artery. Arteries are what pump things out of the heart, to the vena cava, which is our largest vein that we have. And that is, veins are when it's returning blood to the heart. And this pressure gradient that's set up is going to maintain this blood flow. So taking a look at the pressure gradient that we have. So as soon as blood is leaving the heart, the left side of the heart, this is our mean systolic blood pressure measured in millimeters of mercury. Millimeters of mercury. So on average, we could say that we have about a 93 millimeters of mercury of our mean arterial pressure. So it's the pressure that is exerted on the walls of the blood vessels when the heart is actively pumping. It starts around 93 millimeters of mercury, and as it travels from the largest of our arteries, the aorta, down through our smaller arteries to our arterioles, which are our smallest of our arteries, and it loses pressure over this time period as it gets further away from the heart and meets with resistance from these different blood vessels as it's like creating friction as it's traveling through the body. We lose a lot also in the capillaries where we have that gas exchange that's going to happen. We'll talk about more of that when we get to respiratory, and then it collects it back and it returns back to the heart under very low pressure. So when we get into our vena cavas that we have, it's a very low pressure, almost at zero. It's around 5 millimeters of mercury. But starting with this gradient and it's pumping this blood through, it will still continue to flow in the appropriate way and be guided by our one way valves that we have within our heart and also that we have throughout our body in our veins. So taking a look, like, where is the heart? And in America, we talk about how we, place our hand over our heart, which is usually on our left side whenever we do the pledge allegiance to the flag or anything like that. Is it on the left side? It's actually more in the center. And I like this picture over here to kind of show it. It is in the center, but it's slightly tilted so that our apex is a little bit more on our left. So you can kind of see the picture. It is directly behind our sternum and it's slightly tilted. So it's just kind of rotated a little bit so that you can have the apex here that's closer to the left hand side. Here's another picture that we have within our body as it's being surrounded by the lungs. And in fact, the lungs come up and cover a portion of the heart. Those have been kind of reflected back, so you can't quite see them as clearly. But in the actual body, you can actually see the lungs will come over and cover a portion of the heart here in the front. Here is a cross section. We're going to like basically look at a picture next that is this cut going across here and looking down. And so that's what we can see right here. And the reason why I want to show you this is that the heart really is towards the front of the body. Here's our sternum, that breastbone that we have. And then looking at it in comparison to the lungs and just as kind of a precursor before we get to respiratory physiology in anatomy, is that our lungs do take up a large portion of our back. And so I just want you to keep that in mind. Here is our spinal column that you can see right here with our vertebrae right here. So it's just kind of showing you a picture of like where it's located within the body so we can kind of get this vision of it. Now, the heart itself, as with all of our organs, are covered in a covering that allows us to be able to keep things in place within the body. So we have this lining that will cover it, and this lining actually folds over on itself to create this sac that's continuous all the way around. Part of it is attached to the heart itself, and part of it is attached to the chest wall cavity. So basically inside to the chest. And it anchors everything in place, makes it so it's not moving throughout. It also allows for our body to be able to move. And this gap that's right here is filled with fluid. And so it makes it so that friction isn't building up to cause irritation whenever we're beating our hearts, whenever we're moving around, whenever we're jogging, anything like that. It's going to decrease irritation because there's a fluid filled sac in here. We're going to put a few names to these different ones. And the one that I want to focus on first is our serous linings, or our secretory linings that we can have. And they're kind of outlined in the pink, if you can see them right here. And both of these linings, as it is circulating close to the heart and then folding over on itself and being more close to the chest wall cavity, it is secreting fluid to act as this friction resistor. So think of it, if you were to say, take a Ziploc bag and you put a couple of drops of oil in it, and you get rid of all of the air in it and seal it all up. Now, what you can imagine is if you take these two sides of the Ziploc bag, you can like rub them against each other and swirl them around, because that oil is acting there. It's not going to get caught. It's going to be a little bit more smooth to be able to do that. But with it still being closed at the top of the Ziploc bag, if you were to try and take each side of the Ziploc bag and try to just pull it from the middle, it's going to be suctioned together so that the two sides are remaining together because of that fluid that is inside of it. That's the same way that this lining works around the heart, where we are secreting a fluid that is filling up this space. And when I say space, this cavity that we have in between these two linings is really just a potential space. And it has that fluid that is filled inside of it. And it's not much, it's just enough to be able to suction these two layers together and to decrease the friction that is being caused whenever it rubs up against it, right? Now, all of our organs in our body, most of our organs in our body have this kind of a setup. This one that is located closely to the heart or to the organ itself is called our visceral layer. Our visceral layer, visceral means organ, so it's the one that is actually attached onto the organ. Parietal is the ones that are attached to the chest cavity or the abdomen or anything like that. It's the outside portion of it, and it's filled with this serous fluid. Now, what's different about our heart is that it has a third layer, and that is this outer fibrous covering. That's a harder layer, and this one really helps to protect the heart, doesn't allow bacteria to be able to get into it, and this is distinctive to the heart itself compared to the other organs that we have. So all of these layers together make up what are called the pericardium. All these layers together are the pericardium. So it's this three-layered sac that surrounds and protects the heart. The outside layer is this fibrous pericardium, which has got these inelastic fibrous connective tissues that are anchoring the heart into its place in the thorax or in the chest cavity, yet it still allows for enough movement for the heart to be able to pump and can take on increased blood flow when we are exercising at harder amounts. Um, then those two thin layers that are secreting the fluid are called the serous pericardium. The serous ones are thin, delicate, double layered membrane because it folds back on itself. The parietal layer is the one that is attaching onto the fibrous pericardium. And the visceral layer, remember, visceral means organ. So it's the one that's actually attaching to the surface of the heart. It's also known as what's called the epicardium, which is the outside layer of heart muscle. So it literally is like the outside of the heart itself. Here's just another picture that we can look at the fibrous, this outer covering of the heart right here, the fibrous pericardium in this, I don't know if it's a green or a gray color as it's coming down, and it actually circulates and it actually covers all the way up through heading in towards that aorta. Then we have the both sides of the serous pericardium, in which we have the visceral layer that's right on the heart. We have the parietal layer, which is attached onto this fibrous layer. And then inside, we have this potential space in which we have the pericardial fluid in the pericardial cavity. So the cavity is this space, and then it has the fluid that's there. Now, what's kind of interesting to realize is that this serous pericardium, both the visceral and the parietal layers, is really just a continuation of our blood vessel lining. So the linings of all of our blood vessels, and including within the heart, have this lining that is helping to protect it and to regulate what's happening to it. It can secrete fluids, and this is a continuation of our blood vessels themselves. So that parietal layer, remember, is the one that lines the internal surface of that fibrous pericardium. And the visceral layer, or what we know as our epicardium, is just basically the external surface of the heart. Here, I just wanted to show you this picture again because I really liked how it demonstrated. Here is our fibrous pericardium. So this is the tough and elastic one that's really anchoring things in place so the heart doesn't, move out of place when we do, a cartwheel or anything like that. And then you can see the serous pericardiums, and then this is our parietal layer of that, and then it folds on itself to become the outside layer of the heart muscle itself as the visceral layer, or what's also known as the epicardium in the heart. Some people like to look at it and view it as this sac that has this fluid in it. So it's equating it to like if you had a balloon. And if that balloon was able to fold on itself whenever we stuck the organ or our heart, or in this case, our fist into it, how it folds over on itself and it would have that fluid there. You can also look at it as a water snake or like one of those wigglies. If you guys ever played with these when you were a kid or have seen them, right? It kind of folds back over on itself. This is hollow on the inside, but in between these two layers, right, is this fluid that's there. And it allows us to be able to very smoothly move things around in here. And that's what's creating that lack of friction, right? It's the protection from that friction is because we have that fluid in that place. So next we're going to take a look at the chambers of our heart and just kind of walk through what the different potentials are and what we have and what their functions are as well. So when we're looking at it, we're splitting the heart into four different chambers, right? That we have here. This is the right side of the heart because it's as if they were looking at you. So this is their right side, this is their left side. We have our atria, which are the two top portions of the heart, and we have the ventricles, which are the bottom portions of the heart. And what we're going to do is actually walk through what are the different functions of the different chambers of the heart. So we're going to start with the right atrium, and this is where all the blood is returning back from the body, from the head, into the heart again. So it's really, I want you to think of it as just a reservoir or a holding tank for blood that's returning back. It's relatively thin walled because it doesn't need a lot of muscle behind it, because all it's going to do is drop blood from the right from the right atrium into the right ventricle. And the way that it does this is about 80% of it, it's just passively flowing from the atrium into the ventricle. And that's traveling through what we call our tricuspid valve, right? So when that valve is open, when the tricuspid valve is open, it just allows for blood to drop from the atrium into the ventricle. Now, there still is a little bit of blood that will be remaining. I mean, because this is gravity, but not all of it ends up going down. And we have a little bit of reservoir that can get held within the auricles, which are these little ears that we have on it. And so it does have a little bit of contraction that can happen, and it empties out the rest of that blood. So about 20% of the filling into the ventricle comes because we have that atrial contraction. The right atrium has muscle bundles that are called the pectinate muscles. So it does have a little bit of musculature in the right atrium. However, it's not a large amount of it because, as we said, most of the blood just drops passively. 80% flows passively from the atrium into the ventricles. And both the right and the left atrium have this little outcropping that's called an auricle, which means ear, and all it acts as is a reserve tank for the reserve tank. It's kind of like a backup tank that, if a lot of blood is coming back into the heart, it can actually inflate that little area to be able to hold more volume of blood as it's coming through. The right atrium also contains what's called the fossa ovalis, which is the remnant of an opening between the right atrium and left atrium from when we were in our mom's womb. So we don't actually need blood to go to the lungs when we are in our mom's bellies. And so what it does is it just passes from the right side of the heart to the left side of the heart through this hole, which is called the foramen ovale. Then when we are born and we take our first breath, that hole has a little flap that will slam down because of a change in pressures, and it will seal it up, and it just becomes this remnant of where the opening used to be. Now, I will say in about 25% of the population, that actually stays open a little bit to different degrees, but it usually doesn't cause any issues. So from our right atrium, we are now going to move into the right ventricle. So it's going to pump blood and from the right ventricle, we're going to pump blood into the pulmonary circulation. So this is where blood is exiting the heart and going towards the lungs. Now, the lungs actually has a pretty low pressure system, so it doesn't require too much energy to be able to pump blood from the heart into the lungs. So the wall thickness of the right ventricle is not as much as the left ventricle, because the left ventricle is where it's going to pump out to the rest of the body. So it's only about a third of the amount of the thickness as what we'll see with the musculature in the left ventricle. So here's a kind of picture of what you can see here. So these are our ventricles. This is the right ventricle and this is the left ventricle. And you can see the musculature here in order to pump it out as it's going to go towards the lungs. It's not required to have as much musculature here as when it's going to go out to the rest of the body through the aorta. So this has a lot more muscle on that left side. Here's another picture of what you can see. This is actually of a cadaveric picture, which means it's a picture from a cadaver or somebody who is deceased, a dissection out. Here was the muscle that we can see in the right ventricle. And then here's muscle that you can see in the left ventricle. And you can see there's a lot more muscle that you'll have here. This is actually the septum that separates the two, but it also has the musculature there. And then we've got a lot of muscles right here on the left ventricle. You can see just the difference between there. Here you can also see the left atrium and our in our opening into our right atrium right here, coming from the inferior vena cava, which is that large vein that's returning blood from the lower portions of our body. So after it goes to the lungs, and we'll deal with the lungs later, but after it goes to the lungs, it's going to return back, and it's got lots of oxygen now that has come into the bloodstream. So it's oxygen-rich blood, and it's going to return from the lungs through four different pulmonary veins. Remember, they're veins because they're returning to the heart, but this is the one case in which you have oxygenated blood in veins, is in the pulmonary veins. That again is just a holding tank to be able to then transfer the blood into the left ventricle. And here, the left ventricle is where we're going to pump blood into all the rest of the body, or out to all the rest of the body. So this is our systemic circulation. So blood going out to all the different systems that we have within the body. And it's approximately the same amount of blood in each time that it's contracting. And both on the left side and the right side, you will tend to have the same amount of blood that is pumping out in each of the circuits. However, the pressure is a lot different. So from the left side of the heart, the left ventricular pressure is going to exceed by far the right ventricular pressure by about 5 times as much during contraction, because we have to overcome a lot of resistance as it's going out into the high pressure system that's located throughout the rest of the body. So this is just kind of showing you the picture. Right here, it was returning back into the left side of the heart through these pulmonary veins into the left atrium. Here, it's going to travel through our left AV valve, or our mitral valve, or also called our bicuspid valve, into the left ventricle. Here in the left ventricle, it's going to build up with pressure because of the contraction that it is about to have, to be able to pump this out through our aortic valve to go out to the rest of the body. Now, we were talking about valves, and I just want to show you that these valves are all kind of on the same level as far as a cross section of the heart itself, right? So when we're pumping up blood from the ventricles, it's actually going up instead of down. To be able to go here, it's going to go into the aorta, or when it was coming from the right ventricle, it was going into the pulmonary arteries. So when we look at it, as far as the right side versus the left side does a lot more work. So here is looking at the right side, and all it's doing is pumping our deoxygenated or oxygen poor blood into the pulmonary arteries to go to the lungs and then return it back to the left side of the heart. And it's not a far journey, and it's not a high pressure system. Here from the left ventricle, it now has to pump it out to all of our muscles, to all of our organs like our kidneys, our digestive tract, up to our brain as well, and other systemic organs that we all have. So it has a lot more pressure that it has to combat against. So there's a higher pressure that it has to start with. And then it has to return back up into the right atrium. So high pressure system on the left side, lower pressure system on the right side. So relative to the dimensions, looking at the workload, it's needed to maintain the pressure for perfusion, which is getting that oxygen to all the tissues, compared to when it's going to the pulmonary circulation. So there's a big difference there. Now, what I want to do is I want to pause for a moment, and I want you to click and drag and show me your knowledge on what you know about the different anatomical features of the heart. Good. So taking a look at this anatomy, we're going to now take a look just briefly at the musculature, in which when it pumps out, I want you to think of it that it's pumping from the inside, like it twists it and turns it so that it's more like it's wringing out the heart. compared to just a squeeze in itself. So the way that the different layers of the heart muscle work, it makes it so that it's wringing it out so that when it contracts, it's going to push it up here. And it's almost like you're wringing out a towel to try and get rid of all the fluid that's in it, except it's just the heart that we're doing that with. And what it does is it results in a more efficient way to get blood leaving and exiting the heart. So it's a more efficient ejection doing it this way. So we mentioned before the valves of the heart, and this is kind of where we're going to end up for today. Looking at the valves, the function of them is to prevent that backflow of blood so that the blood can only pump one way in the heart and it's not going to pump backwards through the body. So as I said, when you look at a cross section of the heart, all the valves are on one level, even though they're going to many different places. Right? So here we've got our tricuspid valve. Here we have our bicuspid valve. These are also called our atrial ventricular valves. So this would be our right atrial ventricular valve and our left atrioventricular valve. And then here are our semilunar valves. One is going up into the aorta. So this is our aortic semilunar valve. And one's going to be going into the pulmonary circulation. So that's our pulmonary semilunar valve or pulmonic semilunar valve. So the way that the valves work is that when the pressure is greater on one side of this valve, it's going to open them up to allow for blood flow to pass through. When the pressure is greater on this side and it's trying to move backwards, it will slam these valve doors shut so that blood is blocked from going in the opposite direction. So with the valves closed, it can't move backwards. But with the direction, when there's higher pressure on this side, it can actually open those valves and allow for blood to move through. So as I said, we have atrioventricular valves and semilunar valves. So the atrioventricular valves are between the atria and the ventricles. So they're moving from the top portions to the bottom portions of the heart, and they open up into the ventricles themselves. They all have these little muscles that are attached to them to make it so that they can't end up going backwards or blowing out. Think of it like if you were to go out into a rainy day and it's really windy and you don't want your umbrella to blow inside out, right? Have you ever experienced that where you have like the wind is so strong and it catches your umbrella the wrong way and it actually just folds it completely in the opposite direction? Well, we have those, those metal tines that kind of anchor the umbrella in on that one side to make it so that it can't do that. Right? That's what these papillary muscles are. These papillary muscles are acting with little strings on the end of them, are kind of acting like that in order to make it so that you are not able to like fold them back the other way. So on the right side, the right atrial ventricular valve is also called the tricuspid valve. The left side has the left and atrioventricular valve, which is also called the bicuspid valve, or also known as a mitral valve, because it is the same shape as the mitral hat that bishops wear. Then we have the semilunar valves. The semilunar valves are between the ventricles and the arteries, and they're opening up into the arteries, either going to the pulmonary arteries or going to the aorta, our largest artery in systemic circulation. These ones do not actually have muscles attached to them because of the way that the pressure works, and because of the way they're designed, they don't actually need them. But the one that's on the right is the one that's heading towards the pulmonary circulation. So it's our pulmonary semilunar valve, or also known as the pulmonic semilunar valve. And on the left side, it's heading towards the aorta. So it's our aortic semilunar valve. So now let's look at a couple of terms, diastole and systole. So diastole is when our heart is at rest. So we are not currently pumping in our heart. When that is happening, Blood is returning from the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava and coming into the right atrium. We also have blood returning from the lungs through the pulmonary veins to come here into the left atrium. Now, blood is here and it's going to be allowed to dump into our ventricles. So these veins are, or excuse me, these valves, our atrioventricular valves, are open when our heart is at rest during diastole. When we go to contract our heart, what happens is we close these atrioventricular valves so that blood cannot go from the ventricle back up into the atrium, either on the right side or on the left side here. So our atrioventricular valves are open when our heart is at rest so that blood can pass from the atria into the ventricles. When our heart is pumping, when it's contracting, which is what we call systole, it means to work, what's happening here is our atrioventricular valves will close and prevent it from having our blood go from the ventricles back up into the atria. Now, when we look at our semilunar valves, right? So these are the ones that are going from the ventricles into the arteries. During systole is when these valves are open. So the pressure builds up with the contraction of the heart and it starts to push the blood through these valves and it will open these valves to go out here. Here's our right side. So this is our pulmonary semilunar valve. Here on the left side, you can see it's kind of ducking in behind here, but this is our aortic semilunar valve as it's going into the aorta right here. So these valves will open so that blood can leave the heart and go into these arteries during systole. During diastole, the semilunar valves are going to close so that when the blood has pumped into these two different artery circuits and it starts to try and come back through gravity, it's going to collect the blood in these cusps and it will close these valves to make it so that blood is not returning from the artery back into the ventricle. So this is looking at the blood flow through the heart at the different periods. So here we have passive filling. We have blood coming from the atria, the right atrium here and the left atrium here, passively coming into our open atrial and ventricular valves. This is our tricuspid and our bicuspid into our ventricles. So here it's passively feeling. We get a little bit of atrial contraction to move that last bit of blood here into our ventricles and our last bit of blood here into our ventricles. Then we start to contract the ventricles. What that's going to do is close these atrioventricular valves and open up our semilunar valves. So blood now is not allowed, it's restricted from going back into the atria themselves and instead is directed into the arteries. So we close these atrioventricular valves, we open up these semilunar valves, so blood can't go back into the atria, but instead go out to the pulmonary circulation and to the aorta. So that gives you an idea of just kind of the flow of blood through the heart, how the heart acts as a pump, and the blood vessels, at least the main blood vessels that we're dealing with as of right now.